Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the BEC EnviroSeries Online Conference, Urban Transport on the Move, Connecting Policies, People, and Business Opportunities. The following session is entitled Future Private Mobility and Public Transport. I am Raymond Yao, the moderator of this session, and also the chair of BEC Sustainable Living Environment Advisory Group. On behalf of the BEC, I would like to thank our participants, supporting organizations, and most importantly, our sponsors, including CLP Power, MTR Corporation, Shell Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Electric Company, and Hong Kong Jockey Club. Without further ado, I would like to introduce and invite our first speaker on the stage, and Mr. Alok Jain, who is the Managing Director of Transconsult and Expert Trainer, International Association of Public Transport. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Raymond. I am extremely delighted to be here today with BEC EnviroSeries online conference. It is after a very long time we are in a real life situation on a stage, and it's good to be speaking from a bit of a normalcy that we are seeing right now. So before I start, what is happening around the world in this scene of in mobility, and how public transport is experiencing a resurgence? That's what I'm going to talk about. So COVID has done many things to various cities in different parts of the world. It has, of course, led to public transport priority. People see its value. People see this is the right way to move people around in the cities. This is the most sustainable solution. It has happened in many parts of the world. Introduction of bus lanes, BRT schemes. Then you see a lot of active mobility happening, places like London, where almost 20% of the daily trips have moved to bicycles and walk. The city has started painting a lot of bicycle lanes and started giving pedestrian zones. They closed down a lot of traffic in many of the streets. So very active promotion of active mobility. Shared mobility, how to share the ride. If you don't have a car, we are now moving in a very fast pace towards shared mobility, and both in terms of on-demand transport, which is shared transit, as well as private ride-sharing like Uber and Lyft. Then you see a resurgence on electric buses and vehicles. And of course, this is also part of the climate agenda that we are seeing. One positive, if there is a positive, one positive aspect of this COVID pandemic has been very cleaner environment in a lot of cities. And that was primarily because we did not have all this pollution that was happening from transport modes. So primarily because of removal of or less activity from transport modes, the air became very clean. And obviously people realized that tailpipe emissions is something that we can't live with. So there is a resurgence of electric buses all over, from South America to Africa to even Scandinavian countries, which are very cold, Russia, down to Asian countries. Everywhere there is a growing need of, a growing introduction of electric buses and vehicles. Connected mobility. People also realize that transport is not a singular, it's not a group of singular aspects that are put together in a piece of jar. They need to be connected. They need to be fluid. People need to move from one another. So there has been a very strong emphasis on the integration aspects, and where people can maybe subscribe to services. They can plan their journeys from A to B. People are not looking at modes of transport. People are looking at journeys that they want to make. So more customer-centric. Redefining road space. We are seeing no-car zones, cycle lanes in many places. Urban living is being redefined. Places like Paris, they are talking about 15-minute city. So you live and work in the same area, and most of your transport needs can be satisfied by using bicycles or walking. Road pricing, ERP, electronic road pricing. We have been talking about electronic road pricing in Hong Kong for a very long time too. But road pricing is also seeing a lot of conversation. UK is now planning to introduce road pricing all across the country, and primarily to fund some of the tax initiatives or tax shortfalls that they have because of the COVID. So this is seen as one of the sustainable way to generate more income for the public transport. Enforcement. Illegal parking is one of the big problems all over the world. People park on pavements, and especially during COVID, people have been a bit more, I would say, they were violating these conditions more. So there has been increased enforcement. There's a demand for increased enforcement in many places, and using technology especially. A lot of citizen centricity has gone into conversation. Open data, demand for data to be available in public domain. In fact, UITP, the International Association of Public Transport, just last week released their data sharing governance report, and which gives you very good cases and highlights this issue very well. Another one is technology. We have seen a vast amount of technological innovation that was slow, that was not happening very quickly now in transport space. We are seeing scanners, we are seeing automatic people counters, we are seeing telematics devices, tracking system, fleet management system, temperature control systems, all those are coming. Robots, they're also coming. So, and of course, decarbonization. As I said, many cities who had experienced cleaner environment, they have become champions of decarbonization, and they are putting in all the policies needed to sustain this in various cities. But where does Hong Kong stand? Now that is a key question, and I will leave that for you to judge, to build that scorecard on what we have done in terms of mobility enhancement during the times of COVID. So impact on public transport ridership has been very severe in different parts of the world. Places where there have been lockdowns, so-called, where the transport has been restricted to essential travel, the impact has been 70–80% loss of ridership. But on the other hand, in places where, like Hong Kong, where there was no real lockdown, there was no real restriction on travel within the city or on the public transport, the impact on ridership have been 30–40% maximum. So which shows that public transport in the mobility space actually has played a decent role during this. Unfortunately, on the perception side, internationally, public transport has faced a big backlash. And this was also because of very negative statements made by various political leaders. In UK, some of the ministers have gone to an extent of saying, don't use public transport. And this has really damaged the perception of public transport as one of the places where you can catch infection. However, multiple research around the world, in New York MTA, in London Underground, and many other studies have actually proven that public transport, because of a very high degree of cleaning regime and cleaning of the HVAC system, advanced HVAC system, which cleans the air frequently inside the vehicles, is actually one of the safest places to be. It's actually cleaner than your car if you travel on public transport. So there's a big battle between what is a perception and how we can restore the public confidence back into public transport. Mode choices. Now, this is a pattern that is emerging in different parts of the world. I don't have figures for Hong Kong at the moment, but you can see in London, New York, Madrid, Washington, all these places, the buses have been a much favored mode as compared to the trains. For one reason or the other, in railways, you always have to go inside an enclosed space, and that may be one of the reasons why people feel not so comfortable, whereas buses seem to be more flexible, and you can see outside the window. There's a degree of sense of openness, and possibly that may be the reason. But we do see that the buses have recovered much faster in terms of ridership as compared to the trains. There has been various things done in various parts of the world, some successful, some very unsuccessful. Some of the initial recommendations that came from experts was about these occupancy restrictions. And they wanted people to maintain social distancing on public transport. That has, of course, now proven to be a fallacy. It is not really required as long as people are observing decent hygiene. The buses are being disinfected and cleaned, and all the vehicles are disinfected and cleaned properly, and people are also wearing masks. So with those, many of the occupancy restrictions that were imposed in various parts of the world are now disappearing. Social distancing. So UK had been a big proponent of social distancing, but then they did not mandate masking. And unfortunately, even still today, until today, in many parts of the world, masking is not mandated. Now, statistically, it has been proven in many studies that masking has been one of the most effective means of controlling the spread of infection on all kind of, not just public transport, but everywhere else. Social distancing has been, of course, proven to be a sheer waste of capacity. It has put a lot of burden, a financial burden, on public transport systems around the world, where they have to maintain the services and people are not allowed to board beyond a certain level on the trains. But Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Seoul, these kept running. There was never a lockdown. There was almost 100% masking in these cities. And these cities have experienced relatively much lower level of infection spread. We are currently facing a fourth wave in Hong Kong, but having said that, if you compare those numbers with the numbers in different parts of the world, that is still a very manageable number. So masks have been one of the key strategies, and I always say one reason why all these Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Seoul have been successful is because we had a rehearsal in 2003. When we were hit by SARS, we were trained to do masking, we were trained to wash our hands, and that kind of came naturally back to us, and that really saved us from a big impact from the current pandemic. And of course, before we end this topic, it's not just about passengers. There is a huge impact on the front line. Today, do you want to become a bus driver? Do you want to be in a front line of a public transport operations where millions of passengers are passing through every day? You are potentially exposing yourself to a lot of danger, a lot of infection. Do you really want to be? Places like UK, where a number of drivers got infected, and if I remember correctly, 33 is the number of frontline workers who lost their lives. How do we build confidence among staff? Because if we don't have the staff, we can't really serve public transport. We cannot deliver the service properly. So that is an essential part of what we do, is to make sure we look after the staff. We provide them special gear and equipment that allows them to do their work. So the key question here is it a problem or is it also an opportunity? I do feel that it is a problem indeed, which we are facing, which the experts are tackling, and certainly I'm not qualified to speak on that. But from a perspective of opportunity, I think this is absolutely a right time where we can do a lot of initiatives. A number of initiatives are being done in different parts of the world, and we, as one of the most dense cities of the world, should be doing our bit to improve the mobility within Hong Kong. And of course, technology plays a key role in doing that. There has been, of course, technology side, I always say, it's not the technology that counts, it is the people who implement technology that count. How you implement, the processes behind it is what matters. You can buy a gadget, but if you don't know how to use that gadget, it really doesn't work. And one of those things have been some of these apps that came through, big contact tracing apps, which have not been very successful in different parts of the world. So we are faced with a whole big wreck ball that is coming towards us in terms of technology. It is disrupting mobility, it is changing the face, and we will see a complete transformation, hopefully. Some of the enforcement challenges on the masks can be also addressed by technology. So you have mask detection systems, you have facial recognition systems, and these things are operating. China has handled, of course, the whole issue of pandemic spread really well and contained it really well. So that can be improved. In other places, they are doing techniques like smart ventilation inside the station to improve public confidence. Occupancy monitoring is another way to contain some of the spread and monitor some of the spread. Integration of different aspects of transport systems has been one of the key development from the technology perspective. Coming to Hong Kong, I'll just take 2 minutes here, is that Hong Kong is a very unique city. We have very little amount of road as compared to rest of the cities in the world. So one of the densest cities with one of the smallest amount of road space in the world. And even with those dense situations, we have maintained things very well. But in terms of mobility, are we doing enough? And this is something, these are government stats. And as you can see, the number of private cars that are growing in Hong Kong, we have seen a surge in private cars like never before. So number of private cars have literally increased by 80% since 1997. We have 23 years into after the handover, we have grown by almost 80% of the number of cars have increased. In comparison, the amount of road that has increased is very, very little. Only about 280 kilometers we have added during this period. So we are really sitting on a bomb at the moment where we don't have enough road space to manage all these cars. So how to manage this road space? Public transport is obviously the only solution. Having said that, we have stalled a lot on electrification aspects. How to do our bus electrification. Our neighbors in Shenzhen, they have converted 16,700 buses and they have electrified them. How do we do them? We have found a lot of excuses in our electrification strategy in Hong Kong, and I think we need to not look at the problem side of it, but we need to jump on it and try to find solutions to these problems as early as possible. Railways, we have, Hong Kong has among the developed world, if you compare with London, Shenzhen, we have very little railway. We don't have enough railway network. We don't have enough railway station. And this is one of the greenest and cleanest way to travel within cities. And I think there is a huge room where government has to look at railways from 3 different angles. The coverage of the railway system, how connected they are with different modes of transport, and whether there is enough capacity that we are providing in the railway network. So with that, I think Hong Kong does have a future. The things that we can do, curb the private car growth, contain that spread, create a very citizen-centric mobility solution, do multimodal integration, decarbonize the transport with electrification and other new energy initiatives, expand the railway within the city, and move people, not vehicles. With that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Now, may I invite the second speaker, Mr. Michael Chen. He's the COO of Inchcape Limited. Michael, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond, and thank you, BEC, for having me here today and share with everyone. So, first of all, thank you, BEC, for having me to join the presentation. And let me just get my presentation. Sorry. So, apologies for the technology hiccups. Thank you for having me today, and I'm very thrilled to share with everyone about the decarbonization for private transport. I am Michael Chen, and and let's dive into it. So, let's do a quick recap. Year 2020, it is definitely a year full of challenges. We have COVID. We just share with you how challenging that is. We are converging into the 4th wave, and again, people are adopting a new norm. Again, we can see a number of trends. For instance, people are scared and people are converging away from public transport and moving into private transportation, as we previously shared. Again, I know everyone is watching this space very closely about how the 4th wave are going to be developed. In year 2020, it is also a year that Hong Kong is being stuck in the crossfire between the US and China trade war. We are significantly impacted by the trade confidence. And good thing is the election is done, and hopefully with the new chapter, it will be, Hong Kong will be in a better state. Now, one thing, however, that something might have slipped away from my mind because of all this distraction. And I would like to highlight that to you. And it is, actually, this year is actually the hottest year in the past decade. How hot is it, you may ask? Well, let me give you some figures. July was actually the hottest month in Hong Kong since 136 years ago. We're talking about 4 generations since 1884. Also, in July, it almost reached 40 degrees. It is really hot. Imagine walking out similar to in a Hong Kong such a humid environment, it is definitely not an easy, it is definitely not enjoyable. And again, this year we have recorded 467 hours of hot weather warning. Imagine, if we calculated that equivalents to about 20 days, consecutive days of very hot weather warning. So what does it all mean? Well, that means by 2100, probably where my grandchildren will be, if we do absolutely nothing, our surface temperature will rise by 5 degrees. And our sea level, Hong Kong being very close to the sea, the sea level will rise by 1.3 meters. So what does that mean? That means during typhoon and storm, our crucial and critical financial and business center will be hit and will be submerged under the storm tide. Areas like Central, Wan Chai, Tsim Sha Tsui, or even Causeway Bay, they will be submerged. Now, however, good thing is, if we adhere to our Paris Agreement, by 2100, the temperature will be rise by 1.5 degrees. Yes, it's not ideal, but the sea level rise is much more contained to merely less than half a meter. For Hong Kong, we will essentially largely unaffected except for the usual areas that is hard-hit like TAIWAN, Hung Fa Tsuen, and so on. So this is how important for us to do decarbonization. And I am extremely thrilled because the Council of Sustainable Development has recently launched a long-term decarbonization strategic plan, saying that Hong Kong should aim to have to be net zero carbon by 2050. That is a very impressive goal because it's essentially a decade ahead of China. So I'm here to talk about transport and how big of a role is transport to Hong Kong decarbonization. Let me give you a quick example, a quick comparison between the world and Hong Kong. As you can see, transportation accounts to about 17.8% of Hong Kong carbon emission, somewhere ballpark close to where the world is. And I can share with you that out of that, 1/4 of those carbon are coming from private cars and motor vehicles. Again, the rest will be public transport, goods vehicles, and railway. The electricity, although it is a much higher number, but as everyone knows here, our government and our electricity company are doing everything to step change our carbon emission. That I will leave it to my friends to share more with you. Now, in front of you, there is 10 years of registered vehicles in Hong Kong, and it shows you how good we are in adopting EV. In the graph, you can see red, which are all EVs coming from Japan and Korea, and the Germans, and I have specifically highlighted Tesla, a new brand that was introduced to Hong Kong roughly 4 years ago. Wow, look at it. Look at the past 4 years. The EV penetration in Hong Kong is phenomenal. Hong Kong have done so much to step change it. But let's look into the details a little bit closer. We can see that with Tesla, it helps us in terms of penetration a lot, and we are around 1.6%. But hang on, why just one brand? So I would like to share with you, is this good enough? At the moment, a lot of these cars are Tesla, and they are great products. And I think, but where are the Japanese, where are the Chinese, and where are the German manufactured cars? Are they just the red ones? Why are they not significant? Why is the case? Perhaps I can share with you a key few factors that in my own opinion, that affects the adoption. Hong Kong is desperately needing the EV roadmap, because with that roadmap, we will be key distributor will be able to go to the manufacturer and fight for EV allocation and bring those EV in. Worldwide, everyone is fighting for EV vehicles, and with the ambition of government, it helps distributor to bring in the car. This car, however, it takes 2 years. Bringing a car into Hong Kong is a long process, because not just a car that I can bring it from another country. We also have to consider about Hong Kong regulations, as well as the emission standards, as well as the very practical thing down to left-hand drive, right-hand drive. Also, one thing that I would ask you to think about is this a fair penetration to all demographics in Hong Kong? Is that only the rich, or is that the poor, or is that everyone have a fair access in terms of battery electrical? That I will try to answer that in the later slides. 10 years ago, a few years ago, we talked about our ambition by 2020, we have a 30% new energy vehicles ambitions. But where are we now? We are roughly around 12%. So what has changed? A few years ago, we are advocating new energy. That includes hybrid, that includes plug-in hybrids as well as EV. But somehow, during the process, it changed. EV becomes, instead of environmental friendly vehicles, it turns to be electrical vehicles. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have not been able to achieve 30% as high. Other reason could be how good are we in terms of infrastructure adoption. So how are we comparing to our peers? Here's the figures. In terms of EV adoption, given the last 4 years, our snap change is sensational. We're at 1.6% in terms of EV penetration. Wow, look at that. We are way ahead of Korea, we are way ahead of Japan, and we are even way ahead of California, where Tesla were made. But why is that? Well, because a lot of the because EV commissioned, the commission is not just EV. If we also consider electric, fuel cell, plug-in hybrid, and hybrid, well, actually, Japan is doing way better. Look at that, 41% is on hybrid, and for Korea and States, and even for America, around 4% of them are hybrids. So if we compare all the figures in totality, Hong Kong is great. Hong Kong is doing great, but there are a lot more steps that we can take to accelerate this adoption. So most government didn't put all eggs in one basket on just EV because of practicality reasons. Obviously, electric and fuel cell are very good. They have very low emission. Plug-in hybrid are less, but they are transformationally different compared to gasoline. In terms of range, obviously, everyone have a different electric. It will have a more limited range, where plug-in hybrid and hybrid are much more better in terms of range adoption. Again, a lot of this electrical and fuel cell will rely on the infrastructure establishment, including electric charging as well as hydrogen station. But again, plug-in hybrid and hybrids are things that doesn't require extra infrastructure, and maybe that is the technology that we can certainly adopt. Last but not least, on the right-hand side, you can see the cost of ownership. Look at that. Electrical are the highest out of all the technologies, where some of the technologies like plug-in hybrid and hybrid, they are much lower. They are step change in terms of gasoline emission, and they cost much lesser. So again, if we look at the adoption roadmap at the moment, although most of them are using gasoline, you can see electrical are more towards luxury PC, while fuel cell is new, but a lot of mass transport or even private cars can consider having hybrid and plug-in hybrids. So as we converge, as the infrastructure becoming more readily available with electrical and hydrogen, I believe that the evolution will be EV will be more PC friendly, and fuel cell, if Hong Kong were to adopt, it will be more CV friendly to adopt it always. If we look into the policy setting around the world, Hong Kong, we have put in quite a lot of effort in terms of EV adoption. We have 1-for-1 concession, we have FRT concession. But if we compare to Norway, Shenzhen, or even California, the government have put in a lot of effort in promoting plug-in hybrids as well as hybrids. Especially highlight to you is California. They have even catered for low-income populations, and they have put in quite a lot of subsidies in encouraging people to change into plug-in hybrid and hybrids. So for most of the government, they are all in all technologies in reducing reducing carbon. So my humble opinion, what Hong Kong ought to do. Of course, we are extremely thrilled and excited with the EV roadmap it's going to launch in first quarter next year. But what we would humbly ask the government to consider is actually maybe we can consider a much broader definition and adopt new energy vehicle. With that, it will benefit everyone, not just the rich, but also all demographics. It doesn't have such a strong constraint and reliance on government infrastructure. And while we can consider plug-in hybrid and hybrid as intermediate solutions, eventually, obviously, we should adopt to more carbon zero technologies like electric and fuel cell. So if I were to ask us to take some key takeaway, the first key takeaway is obviously we hope that we can adopt into a much broader definitions in terms of new energy vehicles, not just EV, but also consider plug-in hybrids and hybrids. And again, we believe that every technology that is reducing the existing carbon footprint is great, and we should go all in supporting that. So thank you very much for having me today. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Please join us on the stage for the panel discussion. I'm glad to have, in addition to the two earlier speakers, we have also 3 other panelists joining our panel discussion on this very interesting subject. So for those online participants who may wish to send us questions during the discussion, by all means, just send it through the Q&A box. Now with me, we have 5 panelists. The 2 earlier speakers, Mr. Alok Jain and also Michael Chen. I'd like to introduce the other 3 panelists. To my left is Mr. Gary Leung. Gary Leung, he's the head of operational planning, KMB. Thank you. And Mr. Alexander Mastrovito, he's the head of sustainability of Scania. And Mr. Alok Jain. And then Mr. Dan Wong, the general manager, global innovation of MTR Corporation. And last but not least is Mr. Michael Chen to my left, COO Inchcape Hong Kong. I think I want to further explore the future of private vehicles and public transport service and how they react to the new normal after COVID-19 with the growing concern over health and safety and impact of the urban transport on air pollution and climate change. Maybe I start off with the first question to maybe Gary and also Dan. What are the challenges faced by the public transport operators due to this COVID? And are there solutions to overcome these challenges in the future?
Hi, maybe I'll start first and I'll pass to Dan later. So as Alok and Michael has said, year of 2020 has been very challenging for public transport operators. And it's very difficult for us to maintain a sustainable business, I think. First of all, I think our key mission is to protect our colleagues, I would say, our frontline colleagues. And this has been very difficult at the beginning of the year. Say our frontline bus captains, for example, we're struggling to give them even face masks. So without our bus captains, how can we keep our services, our service level? So it has been difficult. And as a public transport operator, we always have to learn, we have to go into areas that we haven't been explored. So we even become a face mask producer now, so as to keep our services to the public. And on the other hand, as Alok and Michael has also suggested, we can see there's a surge of private transport use over the years, over this year. And this is understandable because social distancing or the hygiene of the public transport operators, in the compartment, for example, has been an issue to some of the passengers. And somehow we have to enhance the confidence of our passengers to use the public transport. And we have definitely, as a public transport, as a bus operator, we have explored different ways to enhance the confidence of our passengers. For example, we now spray some so-called sterilization layer on our buses in the compartment. We introduce window vent so that we can enhance the ventilation in the bus compartment. And so-called many different measures. But I think within a year, we still need some time to gain back the confidence of the passengers to come back to the public transport. And now we are seeing this probably is a vicious circle, because when passengers switch to private transport for as a road user for bus operators, the roads become more congested, and then the journey time is lengthened, and bus service become less attractive. So it's like a vicious circle that more and more people will switch to private transport. It's a challenge for us, and we definitely need something to, I think we need time for the passengers to come back. I think, Dan, you also have some experience in railway, right?
Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. And just to add on top of that, as a public transport provider, this has been a very, very challenging year in many respects. And, kind of mission number one is to make sure that we provide safe travel for our passengers and for our own staff. And, we've been attacking this in multiple levels. One level is we're starting to use new technologies as a way to make sure that our cars, our stations, all these facilities that we have the highest level of hygiene and cleanliness. And so many, I think, especially those who take the metro and public transport in Hong Kong will know, we're using technologies like disinfectant robots to more efficiently clean the insides of our cars, our stations, and so we're doing that. We're even trying new types of chemicals, such as antimicrobial chemicals that we use, right, to make sure that we have a very, very clean environment for our passengers, also for ourselves. Like Gary said, MTR, we're also become a mass producer for face masks, which we then provide to our own staff, and this is both our frontline staff as well as our back office staff. And so I think kind of those are two aspects. Another aspect is similar to what Gary mentioned. We have in place a very kind of sophisticated set of internal procedures in terms of how frequently we clean different areas of our stations, of our cars, at what intervals. Very, very strict arrangements in terms of AB and other team arrangements, so that if there is an unfortunate situation where there is somebody who has been infected, that we have a very, very good way of tracing and making sure that we can keep it safe. And so I think kind of very similar to, I'm sure, transport operators across the world, we're attacking this on multiple levels.
So other speakers, do you have any comments on this?
I think I got one more thing to add, is that in the past, actually, we seldom encounter this problem of demand drop. As Alok has said, the demand drop actually like 30 or 40% in one go, and we seldom encounter this situation that we have to adjust our service level that quickly with in that dynamic manner. So in the very first wave of pandemic, yes, it's a bit chaotic for us. But then we definitely, as an operator, we learn a bit by bit. And coming to the second and third wave, and actually probably the fourth wave coming up, we are now working very closely with the authority, so that now we know how to adjust our services with a dynamic manner, and then such that at least for the roadside mission, we do not operate unnecessary trips on the road. We can adapt to the demand more effectively.
Thank you. But we further expand Michael's earlier presentation, I'd like to ask maybe all the panelists, what are the experience in other parts of Asia or in Europe in terms of roadside pollution reduction or decarbonizing the transport sector, and what Hong Kong business can learn from this experience?
I think if we compare to, first of all, decarbonization is absolutely priority for us in Hong Kong, and we should consider all options. And if we look into other economies like Singapore, Norway, and Shenzhen, they all adopt not all eggs in one basket approach. They are actually, they adopt a much more broader definitions in terms of EV in terms of private vehicle and public transport decarbonization. For instance, in Singapore, they have a commitment in adopting a new energy vehicle for their taxis, and that just not only EVs, that also include hybrids and plug-in hybrids. Also, we also need to consider our infrastructure constraint as well. So some of them we might be constrained in terms of charging stations at the moment. Some of them, if we were to talk about heavy vehicles or goods vehicles, some of us in Hong Kong, they don't even have a parking space. So not to even think about whether they have a charging stations. So on that onset, should we just sit back and relax and not to step change our decarbonization effort? Absolutely not. And if we reflect on even China, if we reflect on Singapore, they all adopt a very broad spectrum in terms of new energy vehicles, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and even fuel cell. And again, I'm very thrilled that the government, the Council of Strategic Development have started to talk about and consider about fuel cell. That is something that is extremely clean, it is a step change of the game. I understand that there are challenges if we were to introduce into Hong Kong, but again, we should consider all options in decarbonization of the public and private transportation.
Thank you. Alex?
Maybe I can add some on this, and especially from the perspective then of a European manufacturer. And I think the European Union has long had, exactly as you mentioned, a technology agnostic perspective when it comes to how they regulate the automotive industry in order to achieve certain sustainability objectives. And traditionally, they just specified certain reductions of tailpipe emissions, and they have not yet come to a point where they have started to regulate for CO2 emissions. But that will change going forward. And the EU has now set a target that by 2025, the commercial vehicle industry, then that concerns us and relates to buses as well, is then mandated to fleet-wide reduce their carbon emissions by 15%, which is a very, very challenging target. And then towards 2030, they are increasing those targets as well. And one comment I would like to make is when we're talking about updating the definition of which technologies we should prescribe for, it is true that we need to, I think we shouldn't specify just one technology, but we should upgrade our definition to instead specify what sustainability objectives we want to achieve. So in the case of Hong Kong, I think it's completely feasible to upgrade that definition to, for example, specify that we want to achieve zero emissions from the tailpipe. The reason why we're saying that we want zero emissions from the tailpipe is because in order to create truly zero emission transportation, we also need to have other related industries come along together with the transportation industry. If we're talking for both about, for example, then hydrogen fuel cells and battery electric vehicles, which are currently the only technologies that fit the zero emission definition, they will rely on power generation to become clean going forward. But that isn't really an issue as we see it, because in order to achieve these, for example, the 2050 target that the Hong Kong government now has set out for itself, both transportation and power generation needs to become carbon neutral. And as long as they do that in parallel, we do not need to worry too much about non-tailpipe emissions at the current moment, but we should expect those to clean up as well.
But with this technology that's still considered to be difficult to do in a short period of time. For example, if we want to encourage the uptake more or less immediately on EV, you need to provide the relevant infrastructure in order to enable, as an enabler. Otherwise, it will be so difficult for the marketplace to take it up, right? But what can be done as a short-term response to improve the roadside emission pollution? And so can technology or other mobility management provide any immediate solution? Yeah, Alok, you have a view on this?
Yeah, yes, Raymond. I think that's a very pertinent question after all this discussion. One of the things we are focusing too much is tailpipe. And I feel that that's a wrong focus when it comes to decarbonization. It is not about what you are emitting. It is what you are causing others to emit as well. So if you are part of the problem, if you're creating congestion, and in Hong Kong we have seen that even a lot of EVs that are coming on the road, probably Gary can add how much impact it has on the bus speeds, the increased traffic. So even if you had an electric bus, if it is not moving in the street, and if all the vehicles are stuck, it is actually not a decarbonized world that we are living in. It is creating all other kind of carbon impact. So I feel that we have to look at it from a holistic point of view. And there are a lot of short-term solutions as such, and a number of those I talked about in my presentation. Bus priority is obviously one of the means, bus lanes, and where buses can move. A lot of enforcement issues. I mean, I always use this, that you need to engineer well, you need to design your systems well, but you need to, after that, that's not just enough. After that, you need to educate people how to use it. You need to enforce so that nobody misuses it, and then you have to constantly evaluate how it performs. And I think this whole cycle is needed. What we are missing right now is some of these cycles. There are many short-term solutions. I can list them right here, and you can do it tomorrow if you want to. I mean, goods vehicle transport in Hong Kong. If the 20% of the commercial vehicle, goods vehicle, are actually in the peak hour of the traffic. And many cities around the world, London, they don't allow goods vehicles or delivery vehicles in the peak hour of the traffic. If you just move them out, we already solve a lot of congestion issues. There are a lot of such solutions which can be done in short term. Enforcement is another one. And I think we can improve the mobility aspects. Of course, charging facilities and converting all the fleet in Hong Kong to electric is a long-term process and a costly process, not just long-term. It's a costly process too. So that will take some time. We need a vision. So we need a pathway towards the decarbonization. It is not going to change overnight. First and foremost, we need to change our habits. And I think that is easy to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I supplement
Sure.
a bit? I think I couldn't agree more as well. I think if we look into the earlier data, out of 1 quarter, we talk about private cars contribute 1 quarter in terms of transportation carbonization. But there's another quarter that's actually taxis. And taxis in Hong Kong, they don't have a set limit of useful life. And if we look into the taxis in terms of newer generation taxis to the older, although they are running both on LPG, but the new generation can actually use 60% less fuel. And consider that it is one of the major pollutant, a contributor of carbonization in Hong Kong for transportation. Maybe one of the great effort that government can consider is encourage the replacement of really old taxis. They're running on 15 years, 10 plus years of technology. By adopting a new technology, new taxis, it actually saves fuel, it actually saves a lot of carbonizations. Emissions in terms of the public transport. So maybe just one of the example that there are, and I agree with there's a lot of examples that we can adopt. Just the ones that we mentioned is just only a few that we can, is readily available that the government can consider.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe at this juncture, I'd like to encourage the online participants to send in your Q&A question if you do have it. Now, I'd like to bring back to private mobility. What are the latest trends and how are car manufacturers reacting to the post-COVID market? And any further insights you could share with us?
Maybe I can start then from while we're not necessarily a private car manufacturer, but as we're part of the Volkswagen Group, we do that as well. But I think one of the worries at the beginning of the pandemic was that this business crisis that we were going through with reduced sales and lower revenues would completely derail our focus on sustainability. And that we would revert back to our core business functions and completely put all the sustainability work on hold. Now, almost a year into the pandemic, we have discovered that actually this crisis allowed us to double down on our sustainability agenda. It allowed us to use the crisis as an opportunity to shift the focus within our organization, to focus more on the new technologies that we see that we need to roll out. It allowed us to streamline the organizations, to reorganize ourselves along those new strategic objectives that we had adopted already before the pandemic. But the pandemic kind of allowed us to, stop for a while, think about what we were doing, and go forward in a new direction. So it's counterintuitively, for the sustainability agenda, it has been very, very positive.
Michael,
Echoing on that, this year actually have a lot of impact towards our consumer preferences as well. For new car buyer, they are very, very cautious in terms of taking their new vehicles, because the new vehicles, they want to make sure that we have the disinfectant, we have put in an extra sanitization layer. But more and more, I can see customers are more relying on online shopping behavior. So traditionally, you would have thought a customer would want to go and feel and touch the car. Nowadays, actually, online traffic, we have done a lot of digitalization online initiatives. For instance, we have started our online showroom, and even we have invite KOLs to do online car sales to showcase what is happening with the car. For after sales, for people that is running on repair and maintenance or they need a body shop work, we have also did a chatbot for invite people to take photos, and we can give them an online quotation rather than asking the customer to arrive at our workshop to get a quotation instead. So again, roughly nowadays in terms of our sales, 5% of those are generating from digitalization. And I guess with the upcoming trend with more digitalization, we can see the trend is going to increase, probably even doubled.
Hello?
If I can add, Raymond, I think we are talking about different things, Michael. When we are talking about not about vehicles, but mobility. When it comes to mobility trends, what we are seeing, that more and more private mobility is becoming like public mobility. If you see Ubers and Lyfts, people are, yes, there are cars, but people use them as a public mobility. And more of public mobility is becoming like private mobility, where you can book a seat, you can have on-demand transport, you can have on-demand transit. And there is this whole convergence. And if I can add, most of the car manufacturers around the world now, the big ones, they have invested very heavily into some of these technologies, which they see as the future of mobility in urban environments. And I think rightly so, because we understand it's not about one better than the other, but we understand that none of these extremes are possibly the most effective solution for the cities. We need to find a common ground and adopt the best qualities of each of those and merge them into something that future of the world can sustain on. And I think that is becoming part of this whole decarb. So one end is your tailpipe, but the other end is to make a more efficient mobility solution in the cities. And I think that has a lot of emphasis right now.
Thank you. Any other supplement to add? No. Today we focus a lot on talking about health and safety issues relating COVID to the private and public mobility, transport, and so on. I think we cannot go without citing what has recently happened. That Chief Executive has actually announced the carbon neutrality plan for Hong Kong by 2050. Although it's a vision statement as it stands, our government might very soon will roll out some strategy, and that no doubt will have to cover the transport area, because without this, we definitely are missing the point. So I like the panelists to share about how both the private and public transport will respond to this carbon neutrality vision, and how your particular company is doing in response to possible this sort of plans now is concrete, although just weeks ago it's simply just a recommendation from the Council for Sustainable Development to the government. But just maybe a week later, government has already probably announced they are going to adopt it, and they will by the middle of next year come up with a very clear strategies how the city will go about it. So particularly on this front, I like both private and public mobility companies share your views, and consultants to share your views how Hong Kong should respond to these, and what would be your suggestions. Maybe start off with Gary. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We actually have support from the authority over the years in decarbonizing our vehicles. Like we actually have tried out different kinds of low emission or zero emission buses over the years, like the battery electric buses, like the super capacitor buses, also the so-called hybrid buses. And moving forward, actually, we other than support from the government, it's like my own company, KMB, myself, actually would actually purchase EV from ourselves without government funding. But looking back, they are just pilot schemes. Comparing these vehicles with the whole fleet, it just represents probably just 1% or 2% of the whole fleet size. And it's all down to still, at this moment, the constraints on technology. I mean, the first thing, of course, is on the driving range. For diesel buses today, we have to run like 200 kilometers, some of them even 250 kilometers a day. And battery electric buses today probably can support us, but probably it's just single deckers, as not our usual double deckers in the city. And the second thing, even if we can overcome the challenges for the vehicles, the infrastructure support is very difficult. Let me give you an example. When we were trying out the super capacitor buses in one of our routes in Shatin, we have to build a pantograph in our bus terminus. The whole plan is delayed by months because we actually have to go to different authorities or different companies because, underneath the pantograph, we have a lot of pipes, we have a lot of wires there that we have to sort out. And eventually it's sorted out, but then it's delayed by months. And one of the thing is that there's a policy from the government, but then we don't find it's like a one-stop shop from a bus from a bus operator to coordinate all these things. And I think moving forward, this is one of the challenges. We are happy to decarbonize our vehicles, but we need a very strong government support on the policy side so that we can work together. I mean, there's a better coordination, not just within the government, but with all the stakeholders here. And I think the upcoming opportunities, like in the Hong Shui Kiu new development area, like as suggested in the policy address yesterday, that probably in Kai Tak, for example, they are the new development areas that we can explore to make it to a very low emission or even zero emission areas. We can work together with high walkability, cycle-friendly areas that I think bus can play a very big role there.
Absolutely. Alex,
yes,
car manufacturer.
I think
lorry.
from the perspective of private industry, we really welcome this announcement by the government because this is something we have been asking for a long time. A technology shift takes a long time, and without the correct signals from government, it is impossible for us to know when we should start planning for a different future. And funny thing, like a technological transformation, think from sailing to coal ships, that's a transformation that took, if not 200 years, at least 100 years and more. Now we don't have that kind of time. We are looking at enabling a massive shift in technology in transportation within the span of roughly 20 to 30 years from now until 2050, when we need to change completely. In order to be able to change in such a short time span, we need very strong signals from policymakers. The 2050 announcement is a good first step in that direction. Now we are looking forward to getting more clear milestones between now and 2050. We need to know, for example, when are we required to completely phase out the diesel drivetrain? When will new vehicle sales of combustion engine vehicle, when will they be banned, and when will they not be allowed on the road anymore? These kind of signals are extremely important. When we have those, we can start adapting and start changing our business models and start bringing the new products to Hong Kong.
Thank you.
No, I completely agree. This is to me one of in the policy speech, this was the most bold, brave, and ambitious statement, in my opinion. I think, and it's a great target to deliver 2050 carbon neutral Hong Kong. And as Alex said, you need a good pathway. And there's not one pathway, because we are talking about multiple industries, and there need to be multiple pathways that need to be defined, which takes us to that kind of target. And government has to also provide very clarity on how those pathways would be not just delivered, but how they will be regularly monitored, how those data will be available in public domain, how civic societies can participate, and there will probably require a lot of course correction. I think it's politically would be challenging, and in many cases it may even get a lot of public opposition. So we are not just talking about one thing. So all those things has to be properly articulated before, yes, it's a statement, great statement, but I think to make it believable, we need to see the details. And I think devil is always in the detail that you see. So without the details, it will be hard to make a judgment on this.
Yep, thank you. Dan, any views?
Yeah, I think just to echo what's been said by lots of our panelists here is that 2050 statement is I think, a very, very bold statement in many ways, and it kind of helps in many ways to bring these different pathways together so that at least we're kind of working towards that same goal. For that goal to be reached, I mean, it's so complex, and all pieces of business needs to come together. As a public transport provider, right? One of the pathways that we can then that we've been working on is how do we, kind of as kind of one of the backbones for our transport in Hong Kong, are there things that we can do that helps us get close to that goal, right? Even if we're kind of taking this in small pieces as we move forward. And one of the things we're looking at are there new technologies that make like the usage of public transport more seamless in a way that opens up the possibility that for those who so choose, that maybe they can then switch from just necessarily going for a private vehicle towards maybe taking the private vehicle to maybe a certain MTR station, for example, and then kind of, right, from that perspective then, not only providing a bit more efficient transport and experience for the rider, but then also taking more of these private vehicles off the road, which then has lots of then additional benefits beyond that single one journey. And so I think from an MTR public transport provider perspective, we're kind of looking at all different angles. Some of those angles will be using new types of technologies. Others will be much more in terms of actually partnerships with other modes of transport. So I think kind of these are the steps that we're already working on to try to move us towards a much more carbon neutral future.
Mike?
Yeah, similar. I share most of the comments that our panelists have shared. I'm extremely thrilled by the goal of 2050, and I really hope that it's just not an aspiration. And for that not to fall into aspiration, I echo everyone's comments that the government would actually need to work very closely with business, not just one particular department, maybe a consortium across the government to help us. For instance, Gary mentioned that by erecting panogram, they actually have to liaise a number of government officials or departments in order to have them erect. Same for us on infrastructure, on how we can comply, what sort of technologies that Alex and I should bring in from public and private transportations, advocating with the OEM in bringing cheap and reliable technologies that is benefit to Hong Kong citizens. I think once we have a goal plan, again, the devil is in the details. Once we know the execution plan, we will be able to work around it with our OEM and bring in great products into the market that benefits the Hong Kong citizens for their mobility journey.
Yeah, thank you. With me coming from the real estate sector, I see this carbon neutrality vision. It's not only each of the sector will do our own plan, but indeed the sectors, the whole community, will need to work out a series of integrated plans together. Say, for instance, as a real estate developers, we really like to, for example, offer as much EV charger facilities to enable popularization of EV vehicles, and likewise for other forms of new energy vehicles as well. But in return, we also would start to think about how we can generate this form of energy in a more carbon-free manner, because we ultimately are talking about zero carbon. So what about the power supply source? If they still consist of high degree of coal, for instance, how can it be carbon-free, even though we use the electricity to charge a EV vehicle, say for instance. Similar apply to MTR. If the power supply is still consists of high degree of fossil fuel based or power source, then it's hardly we can argue it is a carbon-free operation. So I see there's opportunity, for example, for real estate to consider the use of more clean power generation on our facility, for instance, how the energy can be sourced to provide electricity to EV vehicles, for instance. As far as we're concerned, we are considering, for example, about using direct current that can actually reduce the energy loss in providing AC to our tenants and so on. So I think the government new vision actually give us a golden opportunity to really rethink our business plan and the way we provide all these services to the community. And hopefully government will come up with an integrated plan together, integrate all this output and input together to come up with a few possible solutions going forward. So I'm very much looking forward to sectors cross cooperation between sectors on this particular, based upon this particular toward vision. Now, we do have a couple of questions from the online participants. So the first question is for Michael, right? You as the car retailer, we're not at the forefront of the production of EVs or hybrid. The decision we make for supporting the sustainability agenda seem to be solely on sourcing the environmentally friendly vehicle models and actively promote the green vehicles to the car users. And in the industry of customer-centric, and the gentleman used the term customer-obsessed, all retailers are trying to serve what their customers want. And if the sustainability awareness of the customers is not strong, and what is the role of car retailer in imposing the sustainable agenda into the traditional car users in the customer-centric era?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question. What we should be really excited about is the new goal, is our goal of 2050 carbon neutral. I think it's just not one car manufacturer or one car retailer, as Raymond you mentioned about. It's across all industries, hand in hand with government in terms of implementation. But what that signifies, similar to what Alex have mentioned, is we, as a distributor, we can bring back the message to OEM and say, hey, we are very committed for Hong Kong to converge into carbon neutral. Please give us great products. And developing great products that fits Hong Kong regulatory actually takes time. So by bringing great products, economical products into the market, I think it will encourage the trend, just like what Tesla have replicated. And people are becoming more carbon aware in terms of our aspiration. So coupled with the infrastructure will become more well-developed, as well as hand-in-hand with public transportations, how we can work hand-in-hand in terms of the single journey. I think it will advocate it will promote and advocate and encourage all Hong Kong citizens to work towards that goal, which is carbon neutral.
Thank you, Michael. But Alex, with Scania, but you also is associated with Volkswagen, right? But you manufacture a lot of different models, some zero tailpipe emissions and some relatively traditional. How do you look at these areas, and is there an obvious difference between operating in Europe as compared to do it in Japan or Asia?
Well, honestly, there isn't a big difference. I would say if you look at academic research behind the impact of behavioral change and personal preference in regards to sustainability issues, it shows that the behavioral change can only lead to a very small single-digit percentage change on the whole. So in the end, what we're left with then is either incentivizing this change, and then usually in the form of government subsidies or support to the industry, or mandating it, which means that you need to make sure that there are no options to the sustainable option. And of course, this is only when there's an absence of a level playing field or a competitive advantage to the sustainable solutions. And I find that from the point of view of cars, trucks and buses, we are there today. Sustainable options are more expensive, which means that we have to resort to a more or less a top-down carrot or stick approach. Of course, this top-down approach can sometimes be instigated from the bottom up when public sentiment changes. And I think we've seen that in Hong Kong in recent years, where the general public and the industry and organizations like the BEC have gained more awareness around this and kind of supported the government in taking a more proactive approach to either support or mandate the sustainable solutions.
Thank you. You got a questions for Gary. Others can respond too, but what about using biodiesel or biofuel like biodiesel for buses to support decarbonization? And we can use waste cooking oil processed locally to support the transition before other cleaner technology matures. Have you ever thought of that? I know the airport authority at the airport, tarmac, all those are already using biodiesel as a fuel stock. Yeah.
Actually, we never ruled that out, and we have been exploring using biodiesel for years, as long as I have discussed with our engineering colleagues. Of course, we face different challenges on the efficiency, on the financial incentive is also one of our consideration, but we never ruled that out. We actually, if I don't remember wrongly, I think 2 or 3 years ago, actually, we did trial internally using biodiesel. And of course, we have to work very closely with the bus manufacturers or to make it not just a pilot scheme or internal trial. We have to, but this is the way we are working on, and we hope that in the years to come, that it can be actually one of our major use of diesel before we try to electrify our vehicles.
May I just comment on the biodiesel question, because we have very long experience from Europe with biodiesel. Many of our vehicles run on 100% biodiesel in Europe. In Hong Kong, we produce enough biodiesel from waste cooking oil to supply maybe 5% of the total diesel supply. And today, all this volume of biodiesel is exported to Europe because diesel is very cheap in Hong Kong, so it's just too expensive to use it locally. But from a sustainability point of view, if you want to use 100% biodiesel for some vehicles, then you need a separate refueling infrastructure. But if you instead blend the diesel supply here locally with 5% biodiesel using the complete production that you have here locally, then you eliminate the related emissions to transporting it to Europe. You use it locally, and you do make a small reduction to CO2 emissions here. And 5% blending into the diesel supply is, for all intents and purposes, more or less equal to diesel. The European fuel standard for diesel does not differentiate between 5% diesel blend and 0% diesel blend. So technologically, all vehicles should be able to cope with that.
Thank you. It's apparently looks like it's a statement, but still see whether Jain, you got any response to it. You has mentioned that, but not rising enough attention is the issue of demand-responsive transport service, which could drastically reduce the traffic volume, but require quite an amount of legislation and rules and regulation changes. Do you want to elaborate on this?
Yeah, actually, it's very ironic that Hong Kong probably was one of the first cities in the world to introduce demand-responsive transport. We had our red minibuses, which are flexible routes, flexible price, flexible schedules, And this is exactly what demand responsive transport is. I think what is missing in Hong Kong is technology. And to me, if the technology is already available, if as an industry or as a policy, if we adopt these in Hong Kong, the time is right, the framework is all there, and I don't think there needs to be a significant change in anything that needs to be done. So red minibuses can immediately transform into a demand responsive transit. Of course, to make it a citywide application with all kind of vehicles coming into demand responsive framework, you would require some legislative changes and legal changes. That can happen during the time, but red minibuses can be technologically plugged in, and you can have swanky, instead of having those rickety old buses, you can, as Michael said, have swanky new buses with all the technology backbone, and they can provide a fantastic demand responsive transport. And that will also solve many of the first mile, last mile problem for MTR, for feeder services to buses, and all those. So we are not just talking about addressing one mode of transport. We are actually talking about using this technologically enabled one mode of transport to enable the whole mobility infrastructure in Hong Kong.
Thank you. Any particular question you want to ask one another?
I think one more thing I want to respond to the on-demand transport, other than the red minibuses. I think actually our group also explore where bus sharing, probably not franchise bus, can be a non-franchise bus arm, on the sharing of buses to similar districts. Using non-franchise buses is also feasible. We're exploring that, and of course we need some technology support internally. And as we said, that if the government can support more, because for the non-franchise buses, actually there's a very strict regulation on their routings or what. But with relaxing on these regulations, it can be a way to enhance the on-demand mobility in the city.
I would just like to add a bit on the bus side. Actually, if you see what is happening in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, people can vote for a bus route, and then accordingly the bus company will introduce the bus route, and if the bus route is sustainable, it will become a permanent route. If the bus services don't do well, if there's not enough demand, then it is withdrawn. It is in a way on-demand transport. It's a form of on-demand transport, and I think in Hong Kong we have very rigid rules around changing bus schedules, even though bus companies are operating on a commercially prudent principle, but they are not allowed to make any little changes to respond to the changes in demand pattern by their own will. If Gary can probably correct me, but if you are applying for a change in a bus route or any schedule of a bus route, it could be as long a process as 1 year in Hong Kong. So it's a huge gap between when you see the changes in demand versus when you actually respond to it. We probably just need to create a better mechanism to respond to such demands, changes.
And I think we still got time to invite more. Q&A questions from online participants. So if you do have any questions after listening to the earlier discussion, by all means send it through. We still have time to respond. But we basically, in order to encourage either people to uptake newer zero carbon or low carbon vehicles, we were effective at encouraging those private vehicle owners, instead of using it, maybe to go down to use the public transport, either buses which are emitting lower carbon, or MTR, which is effectively driven by electricity. So, but there's a sort of process to do it. So if someone who's really keen and want to use the mass transit, they will by all means do it. But still, a lot of people still want to enjoy the conveniency and all kinds of benefit by having their own car. Might be family issues, want to take the whole family out and together in a safe way and so on. People will continue to use the private vehicle. But in Hong Kong, how to populate the new form of energy efficient or carbon-free energy vehicles in Hong Kong, including EV. So what would you recommend to the government, since they have now got an aspiration to have a carbon neutrality plan by 2050? So how would you populate the adoption of this new form of vehicles in Hong Kong at a much faster speed? Yeah,
Well, one simplest option which has worked extremely well in Hong Kong was the introduction of first registration tax in 1980s. If today, if we double, and that has not changed since then, if we double the first registration tax on gasoline vehicles, I think there will be an immediate transition that we will see. One, it will have two benefits. One, it will reduce the car ownership growth that we are seeing, but it will also make a lot of people change from their diesel cars into an EV car. So if we have to just, it's Hong Kong, the economic means work extremely well, and people have responded to that very well. So, and I think those are the levers that government has to pull to make it work.
Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I also agree with that. With the incentive, that incentive is definitely one of the very effective tools that we have experienced. I think we have experienced in van when the government tried to phase out pre-Euro and switch to phase out Euro-free vans as well. Incentive is definitely one. Though there are two issues that I would like to bring out, and I think we need to think carefully when advocating that, is first of all, we have seen huge success in one of the EVs brand earlier, I think a few years ago. However, if we look at the actual registration number, it's not a replacement, it's actually an addition. So I think encouraging people to switch from older technologies and new technologies, coupled with the financial incentive, would definitely help. That's one of the key takeaways that I think we should definitely consider. Secondly, is with the incentives that one received. At the moment, for instance, for technologies like EV that still heavily rely on infrastructure. So should I receive the benefit right up front, or should I actually buy an EV with FRT, with tax, with money in it, and then I actually spend money and invest in my own infrastructure at my home rather than relying on public infrastructure? And once I've done, maybe I can claim that subsidy back from the government. So it shifts the burden from all this infrastructure from the government to actually the consumer. So and it will definitely help popularize our infrastructure and become more EV ready if we were to going down that route. So maybe two observations that I would like to share and consider.
Yeah. What about commercial vehicles, trucks, and so on? Alex?
Yeah, one observation then is that I think there's a great opportunity to use technology to incentivize, or just as Alok mentioned, then increase the cost when you're using more than your fair share of our road system. I think one of the great injustices in Hong Kong is that a double-decker bus carries 140 people, but it takes up the same road space as two passenger cars, which can most of the time carries only two people. But in the end, that the cost of using that road is not accurately reflected into the ownership cost of owning a vehicle. Now, the way you can use technology to deal with this problem is that you can apply the user pays principle. The electronic road pricing pilot scheme for Central is a great example of that, although it's quite limited in scale. But in essence, you can use technology with certain barriers to certain zones, especially congested zones in Hong Kong, in order to put a price on the usage of that road. And if you're an inefficient road user, like a single occupancy passenger car, then that should be reflected in the cost for driving. And instead, that cost can then be redistributed towards better and more attractive public transport, which benefits many, many more of Hong Kong citizens.
Great. And
I agree a lot with Alex and also with Michael's what they have said. Actually, the pilot scheme, I mean, for the way for first registration tax for EV a few years ago, it was a success for EV itself. The number of EV do have a big bloom there. but it does not couple, I mean, the policy does not couple together with the use of public transport. So it only results in the increase in EV, but at the same time, does not encourage the use of public transport. So there are many ways that can be done. Like as Alok said, bus priority. Actually, we're not that selfish. It can be public transport priority, right? We can use some of the road spaces with taxis, minibuses. They are not as efficient on the road space usage as our franchise buses, but they are still much better than the private transport. So it's very, for example, like in Central, the bus-only lane in DVRC is a very successful one. It can divert some of the traffic away from the very central area, I mean the heart of Central. And now Kowloon East is a very congested area, but nothing has been done on the transport, I mean the traffic management there. I think with these measures to encourage people to use public transport, together with the measures suggested, like by Alok, to intensifying people, I mean incentivize them to switch from gasoline or diesel vehicles to EV, it can help the speed of decarbonizing very quickly.
Great. And I got 2 more questions. Is there a role for car sharing in Hong Kong, particularly experience in Europe and elsewhere? Any views on this? Yeah.
Well, I can hazard a guess here. Yes, I mean, room answer is yes, but I think in Hong Kong it's a logistical challenge to implement something like car sharing for precisely one reason. We have, we have very little land, and for car sharing you require a lot of available land where these cars can be parked to be available in different. Let's say if you want to put car sharing in all the districts, you need a number of places in each district where the cars are always parked, where somebody can go and pick it up. And I think we don't have that amount of luxury in the city where the land is one of the prime assets. So we can't, I mean, that is prohibiting car sharing. I think technology and all those things are all there.
And what about decarbonizing water-based transportation like ferries? Would that help?
It's happening as far as, electric ferries are already being tried, and government in the new franchises of ferries, electric ferries, government is funding the purchase of electric ferries. So that is already happening. And I think, that's electric ferries are a prime candidate for electrification.
Right. So again, any question you want to share or ask one another on this topic? If not, yeah.
I can bring up one thing, a little bit on the lines of what Alok mentioned for buses, but when we're talking about goods vehicles in Hong Kong, which are actually one of the worst polluters in the whole transport system, what can we do in the meantime while we're waiting for the electrified products to come to market? Now, there's a transport efficiency is a large part of how you decarbonize goods transportation. And to that end, we are now looking at how can we bring in longer, heavier vehicles that still are adapted and safe for use in Hong Kong. But just to give an example, if you, for example, add one axle to a 4-axle construction vehicle that carries construction debris between working sites. If you add one axle, you can carry 2 extra tons. Now, over a fleet of hundreds of vehicles, those 2 extra tons eventually equates to a couple of vehicles less that you need to carry out the same transport work. And if you need, for example, 20% less vehicles, that equates to 20% less emissions. So these are the ways we're working today with reducing the carbon footprint in the goods vehicle industry. And I think we should continue to focus on that to increase the transport efficiencies.
Great. And one final question from the participants is that would it be more effective measure for Hong Kong government to sponsor the current non-EV users to switch to EV. That way we could promote the use of EV while not putting more burden on the traffic. But indeed, they are already doing that a bit, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
One-to-one replacement
Yeah,
scheme.
but should there be more? I mean, not in terms of numbers, but to try to provide incentive much more vigorously. More than what,
You have one
Japanese doing.
precedent in Hong Kong, and that is in the goods vehicle industry again, where they have had this scrapping scheme for more polluting vehicles, where they've basically said that by this date, if your vehicle is within this emission standard limit, it needs to be off the road by this date. That's a more forceful way of having people transform their older vehicles into new, less polluting vehicle. And one could see that could be an extension to the current one-for-one replacement EV scheme, where they say that passenger cars above a certain age will need to be scrapped, and if they're scrapped, they will be given the same FRT reductions as are given in the one-for-one replacement scheme. Of course, that is already available to them, but you could also introduce this mandatory deadline by which they need to be scrapped, and that's probably a very good idea eventually.
One of them is simply to put the emission standards. I know buses now, you can't buy any buses below Euro 6, as far as I know. So all the buses have to be Euro 6. And that immediately has a huge impact on the tailpipe emissions. And I think similar standards can be applied to all the vehicles that are being sold or that are coming to Hong Kong for sales. And they have to meet a certain level of tailpipe emissions, which means that the cost of those vehicles will go up, which means they will become more comparable to an EV, and hence there will be more parity.
I just wanted to, I think I agree with my fellow panelists. I think a few things for us to consider. I think having more subsidy, having more EV replacement definitely help the environment. But from the user experience, we also need to look hand in hand in terms of whether sufficient charging stations is available.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, it will have a tip-over effect where people just repulsive about EV because there's simply no charging stations. Raymond, earlier you mentioned a point about where our power is actually generated. What is the proportion of new energy, zero emission energy is being generated? I think that's also another consideration. The last point I wanted to mention as well is the split between commercial vehicle and private vehicle. So private vehicle is only 1/4 in terms of the whole transportation of carbon footprint, but one we should not relax about, and one we should be proactive looking into as well is commercial vehicle. So with that, I just wanted to highlight when tuning up that replacement, encouraging the EV, I think we also need to consider a few things collectively.
Thank you. With that, coming to the end of the panel discussion, and thank you for the two speakers and the panelists. We have a very in-depth discussion on this very important subject. And thank you all the online participants joining this session. Thank you so much.